my hair is getting way too long and it's driving me insane. Hello everybody, I'm Roxy, this is recmebook&stuff, and today I want to talk to you about the Booktube prize. So in case you're not up to date with what the Booktube prize is or this year's nominees, I'm going to link the YouTube channel down below as well as the Instagram account so you can catch up. But it's basically a community-based literary award where judges who I think are booktubers or really frequent commenters on the platform. I don't think bookstagrammers just yet, but it might move towards that direction. Correct me if I'm wrong. We read and review and vote for best or buzziest books of the past year. So in this case, we're reviewing 2020 books. And it's a great way to sort of democratize the whole prize system, which, as I've talked in my Women's Prize video, linked down below in case you want to check that out, is very politics driven and very closed off. Here the process is all very open. As a judge, we are not forced to make videos or reviews, but we can, and a lot of us do. So first I'm going to tell you about the whole process. This is my first time being a judge, so I'm very excited to share it with you. Then I'm going to review each of the books in a particular order. Then I'm going to walk away from this video because I'm filming this before the quarterfinals nominees have been announced. So I'm going to film myself reacting to what makes it just for entertainment's sake. Okay, so my experience, the prize is run by Robert. He is the one that appears on the Booktube Prize channel, and he is just the most organized person. We, from the beginning, had all the instructions very clear. He also does such a great job compiling lists. There is a fiction category and non-fiction category. I signed up for the non-fiction category only. I feel like I am more willing to go through a non-fiction book that I don't like and still evaluate it in somewhat of an objective manner than, you know, suffer through a fiction book that I don't like and then maybe I'll just be too angry. If you've seen my January wrap-up where I talked about Kafka on the Shore, you know how I can get about books. Link down below to that video as well. We're assigned a group from A to H for the octafinals. We have to vote, we have to rank our books, and the three most voted are the ones that make it to the quarterfinals. I am going to be completely honest, I got the only group that I didn't want. It was surprising because the books that I thought I was going to love weren't maybe as successful, and then the books that I did love I didn't expect, or some of them at least. My section had a whole ass book on World War II, a biography on Eleanor Roosevelt, who is an interesting person, but considering there is a Mozart biography on another group. There is the Sylvia Plath Red Comet biography that I really want to read, and there's also a Wordsworth biography. Yeah. So as I mentioned before, we had to rank the books. So here I'm going to review them in the opposite order. So starting from number 6 up to number 1. As a general rule, my criteria was not personal enjoyment because I think, especially with nonfiction, if the subject doesn't appeal to you at all, it's very hard to become invested. To a point, nonfiction books can make you interested in things that you weren't before or didn't even think you could be interested in, but it has a limit. So I thought that judging on subject wasn't fair, especially when there are so many books with important subjects. The two important criteria, content in the sense of what did you choose to showcase and why, and form. I think form is the key here. It's like how the content is put together. This list does not reflect my personal enjoyment of the books, although of course that is a factor, especially with the first two, but I tried to judge them on how successful they were on what they were trying to do. Without further ado, let's get into the book reviews. So on number 6, I have Notes on a Silencing by Lucy Crawford. This one I actually really enjoyed in many aspects, but I think it's not as successful. This is a memoir of attending St. Paul's School, which was a very posh boarding school where she was sexually assaulted when she was, I think, 14 or 15. And she reflects upon the way she didn't process that and the way the school tried to silence her and tried to not make a big fuss out of this and how she suffered from it, but her attackers kept going with their lives, and she was the one who was deeply impacted. And it talks about trauma and power dynamics. There is this really brutal part where she talks about how the school knew she had been sexually assaulted because she got herpes on her throat, but they didn't tell her. She was the last to find out. And she also talks about the fact and about how she didn't process it as rape at first because it wasn't what she expected rape was about, and she tried to convince herself that it had been partly her fault because she did go to this boy's room. So it's very complex, and her prose is really good. But the problem, and it's hard to say this about a memoir that is so personal, of course, as all memoirs, but this is about something so intimate and so hard to just confront. So it's hard to evaluate a memoir in those terms. It's a bit cold. But I think her childhood was just too interesting. There was so much going on. And the problem with that is that at the beginning, I thought this was going to be one of the best books I am going to read this year because it opens with her abuse and it follows with a discussion of the power structures that underlie this school and why do these things keep happening and why don't schools do anything. And it looks like that is going to be the focus of the book, but it's not. It has that at times, and when she goes full reflection, those sections are amazing. Or when she reflects upon specific relationships in relation to the attack. But the problem is that she also had a lot going on personally and in personal relationships with her classmates. She goes into a lot of detail. It's that case where the book feels simultaneously too short, but there are also details where you are thinking to yourself, why are you telling me this? It comes across as very messy. There is an attempt at not being chronological, but it doesn't pay off. It's a shame because I think it is a really fascinating book at times. I did appreciate the writing here. The problem often with these sort of memoirs is that it's so personal that maybe an editor has a hard time reining things in because you see how cathartic this experience is for your client and maybe you don't want to press that. So I do recommend this book, but I just don't think it was as successful as the following books on this list. The next book is Eleanor by David Michaelis, and this is a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. As I previously said, I am somewhat interested in Eleanor Roosevelt, but not 700-page biography interested. This was fine. This was a good biography, solid writing. I loved that everything was well researched and well supported with primary sources. The endnotes were really good. For a biography in 2021 or 2020 when this came out, it's just a biography. It didn't offer me a lot of insight into Eleanor's character. I don't think I know her better in the same way that, for example, A Rather Haunted Life by Ruth Franklin, the Shirley Jackson biography, made me feel like I knew Shirley Jackson so well, even if I wasn't a big fan of her. Not in the sense that I didn't like her, I just didn't really care that much about her. I left that biography feeling I love this woman, she's my friend. I didn't feel that with Eleanor, and I think Eleanor Roosevelt was such a charismatic person. It shouldn't have been that hard, you know? So I think it's successful in just being a normal, well-researched biography, but in comparison to some of the other books that were much more ambitious in their aims and accomplished that, I thought this was just fine. If you like Eleanor Roosevelt, probably this is a more updated version than any previous biographies. Don't quote me on that. But yeah. Then number 4 is Eat the Buddha by Barbara Demick. This is about the China-Tibet conflict, and it focuses specifically on one Tibetan town. It's really good in terms of the research, and I appreciated how involved Demick was. It spans a lot of decades, but it's too ambitious, too short, and sections of it read like articles. In this case, it's the opposite from Eleanor. I think because Barbara Demick is a journalist and this work stems from her work as a foreign correspondent, it reads too much like novelization. It doesn't feel like a coherent history book, which is how it's packaged. The people featured in the book that the book follows along are very well fleshed out, but this does that thing that really bothers me, where they create dialogue, but it's made up or it's reported, but it doesn't say where it comes from. So, for example, it says, oh, look at how beautiful these mountains are, that person said. But there is no backup for that. Was this reported to you in an interview? Was this taken from any primary sources? I don't know. That really gets on my nerves. It feels very disjointed in the way that series of articles don't need to feel like a whole coherent narrative because they will appear and stand on their own. I thought this was more successful than the previous two in terms of how the information was presented, but I still don't think it was as strong as it could have been, especially with such an interesting topic. Moving on to the three books that did make the cut. The third one is The Splendid and the Vial by Erik Larson. This was my first Erik Larson. I hated reading this book, but I think it's just a me thing because I really don't care about World War II. This book is about Churchill, specifically I think 1 year during the Blitz, and I just don't care. I don't want to read about it. I'm just done. And if I'm going to get a World War II book, I prefer it to be from a point of view that I haven't heard before. However, what Erik Larson accomplishes here is so fascinating that if you do want to read a World War II book, I do recommend this one. Because you see, when I mentioned that I hated the dialogues that are made up, well, Erik Larson backs everything up with notes. The exhaustiveness, is that a word? I think so, maybe. The research conducted is fascinating. And unlike Eleanor, for example, this book did give me insight into the character of the people it mentions. Talks about their diaries, their letters, the newspaper announcements, interviews that they gave. I like that it doesn't only focus on Churchill, but everyone that surrounded him, including his family. And to be fair, Larson writes exquisitely. So I am very eager now to get to The Devil in the White City. So yeah, that is why, in spite of my personal feelings towards the subject of the book, The Splendid and the Vial snatched the third place in my list. Now let's move on to two books that I'm so happy I read. Happy is not the word, maybe glad. Number 2 on my list is Our Bodies, Their Battlefields by Christina Lam. This book I also did not enjoy reading. I do think you can use the word enjoy to describe your reading experience of books that dive into hard subjects, but definitely this was not the case with this book because it made me nauseated. It's that kind of book that would have called my attention, but maybe I wouldn't have dared pick up because I never would have found a time where I was mentally stable enough to get through it, but I had to for this prize, and I'm so glad because it's such a necessary, compassionate book. It dives into the idea of rape as a war weapon. If that sounds brutal, is because it is. Christina Lamb was so open about the process, both in the introduction and in the sort of epilogue. She talks about her intentions and her hopes for the future and how this could be remedied, although it's very hard because rape has been so institutionalized as a war strategy since war has existed, basically. It also talks about rape in international court and how it has been defined, prosecuted, penalized. So it's a great balance between the testimonies of the survivors, the history, and the broader legal pragmatic. The testimonies of the survivors are treated with utmost respect, but they are not censored, they are not softened. And I also like that it wasn't confined to just one area. Again, Lamb does mention how she could go on, and she thinks she will, now that she's so immersed in this topic, she will never stop advocating for women, but she does meet the limitations of her scope. She couldn't have written about every single region because she would have never finished this book. But she does write about very different regions and very different contexts. So I did appreciate that. Everything in this book is extremely well put together. The fact that it's dealing with such a terrible topic actually makes me admire the form more, because as I said, when the content is so heavy, it's easy to get overwhelmed and all over the place. This is tight. It's so well done. I recommend it if you're interested in the topic, but beware, it's an extremely difficult book to read, but it's worth it. And it's never morbid, it's never too crude. It's as much as the victims and survivors feel it's necessary. Really worth your time. And then number one, it is a true crime book, which if you know me, you know I don't read a lot of true crime. It is The Third Rainbow Girl by Emma Copley Eisenberg. When I first saw this, I rolled my eyes and said, oh, true crime. Why do people love true crime so much? I am very done with that genre as a thing. By the way, if you're interested in this topic and my thoughts on this topic, Literary Disco, my favorite podcast, just put out an episode on crime reads, and they begin the episode by discussing specifically the US fascination with true crime and how it's spreading everywhere. Very interesting, and I think writer is completely on point. So I'll link that below as well. Anyways, this is about the so-called rainbow murders that apparently were a big issue in the 80s. There were these women who were on their way to something called the Rainbow Gathering in Appalachia, and they were murdered. For a long time, there were no prosecutions because there wasn't enough evidence. And then in time, a person confessed, but he was schizophrenic. And so what Copley does here partly is to dive into media's response to the murders, how there have been waves of resurgence in interest, the difference in the treatment of the suspects. That was very interesting actually, because there is no right answer. So Copley really has to dig and really has to piece this narrative together, really has to engage with the material. She spent 5 years researching this. But that's not the greatest part of the book. This is really a hybrid true crime memoir, where the memoir aspect is of Emma Copley Eisenberg going as a young woman to live in an all-women sort of camp where she was a mentor to a lot of young teenage girls. She also got very involved in the Appalachian community. That is the brilliance of this book. Emma Copley here takes two very different subjects and merges them together. And the last chapter, she talks about thinking how this place that it's so closed off and it's so stigmatized, but also kind of mythologized in American culture and American imagination, was home to her for a time. It talks about sexuality and gender politics and how, for example, she stayed with a guy for maybe longer than she should have because she felt that he was her ticket of entrance into this community. She talks about her complex feelings towards femininity and womanhood and other females, and oh my god, it's just so good. It makes sense to the gendered approach to the murders as well, because the victims were female. It's just so good. It took me completely by surprise. It is so well written and of course so well researched. It's so personal too, but in a way that works. You know, when things get so personal, it's very hard to make sure everything is tightly presented and well put together. And this did it. This was one case where I discovered something that I wouldn't have looked twice if I had seen this beautiful, yes, but you know, true crimey cover on the true crime section. I wouldn't have picked this up, but reading it was truly a fascinating experience. I got completely immersed. It's still humane, it's not morbid, it's just so good. Those are my thoughts. I was very pleased to see that all the other groups had books I voted for. I did sign up to judge the second round, so we'll see what I get to review for that. I am very happy to be part of this prize because I think it's such a great initiative. I am going to add my reactions once the quarterfinal nominees are announced, but I still am interested in knowing, have you read any of these books? Do you plan on reading any of these books? Do you agree with my placing of the books? It's okay if you don't. This is just my way to do it. Are you following the prize? Are you excited for something in particular? Tell me your experience, especially with fiction, because I don't follow that closely. Any and all comments can go down below. Okay, so we're here on the day of the octafinal results reveal. I haven't looked at them yet. This is the only prize I actually follow, like actively, and I read the books because I have to. So let's, milk it. Also, I apologize for my hair. I actually washed it today, even though it does not look like it. I was taking a cat nap. And also, I should cut it. That's the truth. But we are in lockdown, so I can't go to the hairdresser. And I am not doing that to my own hair. I can't cut it myself. Alright, let's see what made it. Oh my god, I'm so nervous. Is this what people who wait for like the Booker and the Women's Prize nomination feel like? I can understand the hype now. Okay, that is interesting. The third Rainbow Girl didn't make it, which is very disappointing. Notes on a Silencing did make it. I am happy because it was a book that I really did like. Also, Eat the Buddha, which I enjoyed, but I still think it has a lot of flaws, so I don't know. And then Our Bodies, Their Battlefields, which, yeah, I'm so happy about that. That book deserves to win even. Yeah, that was interesting, wasn't it? Let us see what I will have to read next. Check out my social media and my other projects, all listed down below. See you next time.